Opening the diagonal for the queen and bishop immediately establishes central influence. Immediately challenging the center's dominance, this opening boldly sets up a symmetrical pawn struggle and invites complex tactical exchanges. Unleashing the open Sicilian, this knight hop aims to gain central influence and prepare for rapid development, subtly pressuring black's typical pawn advances. Boldly challenging white's central pawn, this knight reinforces black's own territory and prepares to contest the d4 square. Developing the knight this way prepares to challenge black's kingside control, but it does withdraw from the central fight for now. Unleashing central presence now, black boldly challenges white's king's knight for initiative and pawn structure. A bold centralization, ND, aggressively contests crucial central squares and eyes potential breakthroughs. Developing the knight to f6 strikes at white's d5 outpost and prepares to castle, contesting central influence. This retreat of the knight opens up the diagonal for the queen, while preparing to reinforce the d5 outpost. Solidifying central control and preparing to castle, this bishop's placement aims to maintain flexibility and avoid early tactical skirmishes. Targeting the f7 pawn, white aims to exploit black's slightly passive knight placement on f6, setting up potential kingside threats. This move introduces a diagonal pressure that black must acknowledge and defend against. Bringing the king to safety, a vital defensive maneuver, now that the center is somewhat locked and white has developed their bishop aggressively. Solidifying the central pawn chain and preparing for potential pawn breaks like c3 or f4, this unassuming step subtly improves white's queenside space and prepares the bishop to join the fray on g2, aiming for long-term positional pressure. Securing the kingside against potential knight intrusions or bishop checks, this pawn push preemptively addresses tactical overreach. Unleashing an aggressive pawn storm on the kingside, this daring advance aims to shatter black's pawn structure and pry open lines towards the castled king, though it undeniably weakens white's own king's safety and might invite counterplay if not supported judiciously. Solidifying the center while creating space for the queen to potentially reposition is a sensible response to white's aggressive pawn push. Pushing the f-pawn further aggressively opens lines towards your monarch, creating a potential weakness that black could exploit with piece activity. Yet it also gains valuable territory and aims to restrict black's central influence. Initiating queenside expansion, 9. b6 seeks to contest white's imposing central space and potentially open lines for black's own pieces. This move signals an intention to challenge the pawn phalanx that white has meticulously constructed, aiming to create counterplay on the flank while simultaneously reinforcing the pawn chain. It's a strategic decision that prioritizes queenside activity and aims to disrupt white's harmonious development. Aggressively probing the kingside, this pawn thrust opens critical lines and prepares a potential pawn storm, aiming to destabilize black's defensive structure and expose their monarch. Unveiling the diagonal, the bishop directly challenges the advanced kingside pawn structure, subtly preparing for potential queenside expansion, and aiming to unburden the c6 knight from defending the e5 pawn. Prophylactically securing the queenside, white intends to prevent any immediate queenside expansion by black, particularly b5. This quiet maneuver also subtly prepares for a potential pawn storm on the kingside, leveraging the current pawn structure. Unlocking the c-file is a primary objective, and redeploying the rook to this active square prepares for potential pawn breaks and puts immediate pressure on white's queenside. Sacrificing the knight opens lines, potentially creating weaknesses around black's castled king while simultaneously simplifying the pawn structure. The bishop, now freed from its pawn shield, finds a more active diagonal, eyeing the kingside while simultaneously bolstering the central pawn structure against further encroachment. Unleashing the queen prematurely here, QH*, creates immediate attacking pressure towards black's kingside, but it might be a bit hasty, leaving her exposed and potentially blocking white's own developing pieces from efficiently reinforcing the central advances that were building previously. The diagonal she now claims is sharp, but will white be able to follow up effectively, or will black's well-placed bishop on b7 and solid pawn structure on the kingside manage to weather this sudden storm and perhaps even exploit the queen's forward position. Shifting the knight to e7 is a solid defensive maneuver, reinforcing the king's safety while preparing for potential counterplay. Unleashing a bishop's diagonal assault, white aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially expose the king. Shattering the pawn center with this pawn thrust dramatically reshapes the battlefield, opening diagonal lines for your queen and bishop, while simultaneously creating new attacking avenues for your knights should they find suitable squares, forcing white to immediately address the encroaching central threat and potentially disrupting their planned kingside expansion by creating urgent tactical complications. Dissipating black's formidable knight outpost with this capture, white surrenders the bishop pair, a significant positional concession that could manifest as a weakness in the long run, especially on an open board. Observe how the formerly cramped dark squares around the black king now gain a sliver of breathing room, even if only temporarily. This exchange, while clearing lines, simultaneously alters the dynamic. White must now find new ways to exert pressure, perhaps through a kingside pawn storm or by exploiting the potential overextension on the queenside. The immediate consequence is a simplification of the tactical landscape, but the deeper implications revolve around whether white can compensate for the loss of their key dark-squared piece. Seizing the opportunity, black initiates a bold exchange on c4, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially open lines for counterplay. This capture not only removes a key attacking piece for white, but also forces white to react defensively, creating a dynamic shift in the board's tactical landscape. By embracing this trade, black seeks to exploit any lingering weaknesses created by white's earlier piece activity and aims to develop their pieces more harmoniously, hoping to leverage the newly created space on the queenside. The game's character sharpens considerably with this aggressive pawn grab. The queen repositions aggressively, preparing to exploit the open lines created on the kingside, while simultaneously eyeing the d4 square as a potential staging ground for further infiltration. Exposing the king to the harsh glare of the queen and bishop often invites disaster, and this king's sidestep attempts to shore up defenses by creating a pawn chain. Unlocking the c-file immediately after black's pawn captures is a bold strategic decision, aiming to exploit the open lines before black can consolidate their pieces. Black is now aiming to activate the queen, eyeing potential threats on the kingside and seeking to exploit the currently unprotected white king. Initiating a crucial simplification, white exchanges a bishop for a knight, aiming to alter the pawn structure and potentially open lines for attack. This decision profoundly impacts the character of the ensuing middle game, shifting focus towards piece activity and precise maneuvering rather than intricate pawn skirmishes. The resulting position will demand a keen understanding of how to exploit the newly created weaknesses and coordinate your remaining forces effectively. Reclaiming the pawn offers immediate relief, but critically, it centralizes the queen to a more active square, preparing for potential skirmishes on the kingside and supporting the e-pawn's future advance. Opening the f-file after capturing on g6 creates immediate attacking potential against black's king, forcing a decision about its safety or a costly pawn sacrifice to alleviate the pressure. Opening up lines to your king, this pawn recapture might seem like the only option, but it creates serious weaknesses around your monarch. You've just accepted a positional concession, sacrificing pawn structure for what appears to be temporary material equality, which the opponent will surely exploit. The dark squares near your king are now exposed, inviting immediate danger from the bishop on g5 and the queen on g4, setting up a potential mating net. Unleashing the queen creates a dazzling mating net by exploiting the compromised dark squares around the black king, forcing a critical decision. A desperate defense, sacrificing the queen's pawn to escape immediate checkmate, now forces a strategic reckoning as the black king is exposed on the kingside. Initiating a simplification that drastically alters the endgame dynamics, this exchange of queens leads to a materially unbalanced position where white sacrifices immediate attack for long-term structural advantages. The open files, particularly the semi-open f-file now fully controlled by white's rook, become paramount, promising significant pressure on black's king's shelter. Consider how the repositioning of white's pieces will exploit the lingering weaknesses around black's monarch, potentially creating a mating net or winning material through precise infiltration. With the queens now off the board, the king's latent vulnerability is suddenly brought into sharp focus. Seizing the open file opens a direct avenue towards the enemy monarch, simultaneously pressuring black's exposed king and preparing potential advancements. Re-establishing rook presence on the open d-file is a crucial defensive maneuver, aiming to neutralize white's recent pawn capture and prevent further infiltration. Exchanging the rooks here simplifies the position dramatically, ushering in an endgame where white's advantage stems from the exposed black king and better pawn structure on the queen side. Relinquishing the open file doesn't sting too badly now that both queens are off the board, as the rook can establish a stronger presence on the d-file, aiming to disrupt white's central pawn structure and potentially support a future pawn advance. The knight's foray to d5, venturing into the heart of black's weakened central structure, aims to exploit the open d-file and exert pressure on the queen side where black's pieces are still recovering from the recent exchanges. This bold repositioning, bypassing immediate pawn captures, signals a desire to disrupt black's nascent coordination and potentially fork weakened pieces or control crucial squares that will become vital in the looming endgame. Black's pawn push on the queen side, aiming to disrupt white's centralized knight and gain some queenside space, is a double-edged sword, potentially creating weaknesses in the pawn structure while simultaneously seeking counterplay. Opening the c-file offers a direct route for the rook, immediately challenging black's isolated pawn structure and hinting at a potential endgame advantage where piece activity will be paramount. Liberating the bishop from its pinned position on d5 opens critical lines for black's remaining forces, fundamentally altering the endgame's tactical geometry and aiming to exploit the slightly exposed white king in the long run, even if it means accepting an isolated d-pawn. Opening the central file with the pawn now creates a clear path for your rook to become active and potentially pressure black's isolated d-pawn, introducing a dynamic element into what was becoming a rather static endgame. Opening the queen side for immediate pawn breakthrough, this move injects significant activity into an otherwise quiet position, potentially disrupting white's rook activity and threatening to create a dangerous passed pawn on the c-file. Opening the queenside majority, white aims to activate the queenside pawns and potentially create a passed pawn, disrupting black's solidified central structure and the tension on the d-file. Sinking the rook into the d-file is a bold statement, directly challenging white's already precarious central pawn chain and aiming to exploit the semi-open nature of the d-file for black's own advantage. Focusing the king amidst the rubble of shattered pawns is paramount now, aiming to connect the remaining rooks and build a stable defensive bastion before the opponent's advanced pawns strangle white's position. The rook now actively penetrates the 7th rank, disrupting white's pawn structure and threatening to seize control of the open d-file, a crucial element in this endgame transition where even minor material advantages can become decisive. Reclaiming the open file is a natural priority, aiming to challenge black's entrenched rook and potentially exploit any weaknesses that arise from the pawn structure on the queen side. The recapture on the e-file opens up a crucial diagonal for black's monarch, forcing a king maneuver that risks exposure. Initiating a king escape from the active threat is the immediate priority, repositioning for potential defense rather than allowing further checks from the rook. King safety is now paramount as your rook storming the opponent's ranks forces a crucial king maneuver. This checks the king's escape routes and initiates a sharp tactical sequence where calculation accuracy will decide the outcome. Reclaiming the center is paramount now that both sides have doubled pawns on the king side. Consolidating the position with the king's repositioning offers a better defensive structure. Suddenly, the forgotten passed pawn on c3 bursts into life, threatening to become a queen and drastically altering the endgame's landscape. Opening the queenside flank grants black excellent counterplay by activating their rook on the semi-open c-file, posing immediate threats to white's pawn structure and potentially targeting the vulnerable king.